In the heart of the Arkansas Delta lies Phillips County, a place where the land tells stories older than most textbooks dare to reveal. In the early 20th century, this county was home to a predominantly black population, descendants of formerly enslaved people who had remained tied to the soil as sharecroppers. Life here was shaped not by freedom, but by a system designed to keep them dependent. Farmers worked long, grueling hours under the scorching sun, harvesting cotton that would rarely yield fair payment. White landowners controlled every aspect of the economy, from setting prices for crops to running plantation stores where workers were forced to buy supplies at exorbitant rates. Debt was a constant companion, and for many, there was no escape. But this was more than a story of hardship, it was a story of resilience. Despite the overwhelming odds, black farmers in Phillips County began to organize, seeking justice and fairness in a system stacked against them. They formed unions, held meetings, and demanded the dignity that was rightfully theirs. Their courage challenged the established order, and what unfolded next would mark one of the most devastating chapters in American history: the Elaine Massacre of 1919. Today, we bring that history to light, not to dwell on tragedy alone, but to honor the strength and determination of those who stood up in the face of injustice. Join us as we uncover the story behind the headlines, explore the events that shaped a community, and remember the voices history tried to silence. If you want to witness this powerful story, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and share this video so more people can learn about this hidden chapter of history. The past may be painful, but remembering it is the first step toward understanding and change. By the time the guns fell silent at the end of World War I, the United States found itself a nation in transition, grappling with profound changes that would reverberate across every corner of society. Millions of soldiers returned home carrying not only the scars of battle but also a new sense of self-worth, particularly among African American veterans who had served their country with honor and courage overseas. These men and women, having experienced even a glimpse of equality abroad, returned to a homeland still shackled by systemic racism, where the color of their skin determined the limits of their freedom and opportunity. The dissonance between their service and the discrimination they faced created a combustible tension, one that was mirrored across the nation in neighborhoods, factories, and farmlands. Economic pressures only heightened these tensions. The post-war period was marked by inflation, unemployment, and fierce competition for jobs and housing, with black workers often viewed as a threat by white laborers struggling to maintain their livelihoods. In cities like Chicago and Washington, D.C., racial animosity boiled over into violent confrontations, and the year 1919 became etched in history as the Red Summer, a period during which racial violence erupted in more than 36 American cities. This violence was not random. It was fueled by fear, resentment, and the entrenched belief in white supremacy, creating a volatile environment in which even the smallest spark could ignite chaos. In rural areas, the pressures of the Red Summer were no less intense. The Arkansas Delta, where Phillips County sat, was a microcosm of the larger national struggle, where the intersection of economic exploitation and racial hierarchy created a constant state of tension. Black sharecroppers, already living under the oppressive control of white landowners who manipulated crop payments and trapped them in cycles of debt, began to assert themselves in ways that were seen as threatening to the established order. The very act of organizing for fair treatment, of forming unions and demanding accountability, was perceived not as a call for justice but as rebellion. Amid this climate, fear and misinformation spread rapidly. Rumors of insurrection and violent uprisings traveled faster than facts, often amplified by local authorities and media outlets eager to protect the existing power structure. White communities, anxious to maintain dominance in both economic and social spheres, interpreted these acts of self-advocacy as direct threats, leading to preemptive displays of force. What began as the pursuit of equitable treatment for hard-working black farmers became framed as a confrontation of epic proportions, a supposed challenge to the very foundations of society. This volatile mixture of post-war disillusionment, economic strain, and racial tension set the stage for the tragic events that would unfold in Elaine, Arkansas. It was a community caught between hope and fear, resilience and repression, where the courage of ordinary men and women striving for fairness collided with a system determined to maintain control at any cost. The Red Summer was not just a backdrop. It was the air the people of Phillips County breathed, the invisible pressure pressing down on their daily lives, and the context that made the tragedy both possible and unavoidable. It illuminated the broader patterns of injustice, showing how national tensions could explode locally, leaving devastation that would echo for generations. In Elaine, as across the nation, the post-war realities revealed that progress was not guaranteed, that the return to peace did not erase centuries of inequality, and that the struggle for justice was as urgent as it had ever been. The events of 1919 would demonstrate the dangerous consequences of systemic oppression, economic disparity, and societal fear, creating a landscape where courage and survival were inseparable, and where the fight for dignity carried the highest possible stakes. Amid the simmering tensions of post-war America, the black farmers of Phillips County faced a daily reality that tested both their endurance and their resolve. For generations, their lives had been shaped by a system that sought to control every aspect of their labor and limit every opportunity for advancement. The cotton fields that stretched for miles were not merely fields. They were arenas where economic survival, personal dignity, and human rights were constantly negotiated under the shadow of white dominance. Crop payments were manipulated, accounts at the plantation stores were inflated, and debts mounted with a precision designed to keep black laborers bound to the land and powerless to challenge their circumstances. Yet even in such oppressive conditions, a spirit of resilience and self-determination began to emerge, a quiet but unyielding force that would challenge the existing order. At the forefront of this movement was Robert Lee Hill, a man whose vision extended beyond mere survival to the possibility of justice and fairness for his community. Hill understood that change required organization, solidarity, and the courage to demand what was rightfully theirs, in response to the exploitation and systemic injustice faced by black sharecroppers. He founded the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America, a bold initiative aimed at empowering laborers to claim both fair compensation and a voice in matters that directly affected their lives. The union was not merely a collective of workers. It was a beacon of hope, a declaration that the people of Phillips County would no longer accept arbitrary control and economic manipulation as the natural order of life. The work of the union extended far beyond petitions and letters. Meetings were convened in churches and community halls, places that had long served as safe havens where voices silenced elsewhere could speak freely. These gatherings became incubators of strategy, education, and mutual support as farmers shared their experiences, compared accounts, and planned collective action to ensure that payments for their crops were fair and timely. Legal avenues were also explored, with the union enlisting the assistance of attorneys who could advocate for their rights in a system heavily biased against them. This multifaceted approach, combining grassroots organization with legal support, represented a level of sophistication and courage that was deeply threatening to the white landowners who had long relied on the subjugation and division of the black workforce to maintain their wealth and authority. As the union grew, so too did the attention and concern of those invested in preserving the status quo. Rumors of rebellion and insurrection began to circulate, magnified by those who feared that the assertion of basic economic rights might evolve into broader social challenges. What the black farmers saw as a just and necessary step toward fairness was interpreted by others as a dangerous upheaval, a challenge to the established racial hierarchy and economic dominance. The tension between these two perspectives created a precarious environment, where the mere act of seeking justice could be misconstrued as a provocation worthy of violent suppression. In this context, the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America became more than an organization. It became a symbol of resistance, courage, and the unyielding pursuit of human dignity. Every meeting held, every strategy discussed, and every demand for fairness was an act of defiance against an entrenched system that had for decades sought to render black lives invisible and powerless. Hill and his fellow organizers were acutely aware of the risks, yet they pressed forward, driven by the belief that their labor and their lives deserved respect, that their families deserved security, and that a more equitable future was possible even in the face of overwhelming opposition. The story of Hill and the Union is a reminder that progress often begins with ordinary people recognizing their collective strength and refusing to accept injustice as inevitable. It illustrates how courage and organization can confront systemic oppression, how communities can empower themselves even when the odds are stacked against them, and how the pursuit of fairness can ignite both hope and fear, creating the conditions for historic events that will shape the lives of generations to come. As the sweltering heat of late September 1919 pressed down on the Arkansas Delta, the small community of Hoop Spur became the focal point of a struggle that had been quietly building for months. The black farmers of Phillips County, weary from years of exploitation and bound by the unrelenting demands of the cotton fields, had gathered at a modest church to meet under the banner of the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America. This was not merely a meeting. It was a statement of defiance, a declaration that they would no longer endure manipulated payments, hidden debts, and a system designed to keep them subservient. Inside the church, men and women spoke in hushed but resolute tones, sharing their grievances, reviewing accounts, and planning steps to secure fair compensation for their harvests. Every word, every gesture carried weight, for the farmers knew that this was more than an economic struggle, it was a fight for dignity and self-determination. Outside, however, the air was charged with suspicion and fear. Local white authorities, plantation owners, and nearby residents had caught wind of the meeting, interpreting it not as an appeal for fairness, but as a potential insurrection. The climate of the Red Summer, with racial unrest spreading across the nation, had heightened anxieties and sharpened the perception of any organized action by black citizens as a direct challenge to white dominance. Rumors traveled faster than the facts, inflaming tensions and laying the groundwork for an inevitable confrontation. The community had become a tinderbox, where any spark, real or imagined, could ignite violence. At approximately 11:00 m, that spark arrived in the form of armed white men descending upon the church. Confronted by guards hired to protect the gathering, a violent exchange erupted. Amid the chaos, a white security agent associated with the Missouri Pacific Railroad was killed, an event that would become a catalyst for tragedy far beyond the boundaries of Hoop Spur. What had begun as a peaceful meeting to assert the rights of black farmers was now framed by the wider public as the beginning of a violent uprising, with narratives quickly manipulated to justify reprisals and reinforce entrenched power structures. News of the incident traveled swiftly, reaching the county seat and stirring alarm throughout Phillips County. Calls for intervention echoed across the region, drawing veterans, law enforcement, and white citizens from surrounding towns into a coordinated response. The combination of fear, misinformation, and prejudice created a dangerous momentum that could not be easily reversed. In the eyes of those mobilizing against the Union, the death of the security agent became evidence of a broader threat, and any black person in the area, regardless of participation, could be perceived as complicit. Inside the church, and throughout the surrounding homes, the farmers and their families now faced an unimaginable reality. A gathering intended to protect their livelihoods and organize for justice had unintentionally set off a chain of events that would expose them to violent retribution. Their courage, once a source of hope and solidarity, was now entangled with fear and suspicion, and the very act of asserting their rights had transformed into a dangerous provocation in the eyes of a hostile majority. This moment in Hoop Spur illustrates the volatility of the era, where even peaceful efforts to claim justice were met with deadly force, and where systemic inequities could turn community gatherings into flashpoints for tragedy. It is a stark reminder of the precarious balance between advocacy and survival, of how courage in the pursuit of fairness can collide with societal fear and prejudice, and how one night's events, seemingly isolated, can ignite a chain reaction that changes the course of history for an entire community. The attack on that September evening was not just an incident. It was the beginning of a reckoning that would expose the depth of injustice, the fragility of peace, and the enduring strength of those who dared to fight for their rights. By the first light of October 1st, 1919, the tension that had been simmering in Phillips County erupted into a wave of violence that would leave scars on the land and its people for generations. Word of the confrontation at the Hoop Spur Church had spread like wildfire, and fear, anger, and prejudice coalesced into a force of unprecedented brutality. Within hours, more than 1,000 white men, local vigilantes, plantation owners, law enforcement officers, and even state troops descended upon the black communities surrounding Elaine. They arrived with weapons, horses, and a determination to restore what they viewed as the proper order, blind to the humanity of those they pursued. Their mission was framed as the suppression of an insurrection, but in reality, it was a systematic and merciless campaign to assert dominance through terror. The violence was indiscriminate. Women and children found no sanctuary as mobs swept through fields, homes, and wooded areas, firing into crowds, burning dwellings, and destroying the crops that represented both livelihood and survival. Families who had labored for months to harvest cotton watched helplessly as flames consumed their homes and possessions, while neighbors were shot or driven into swamps and thickets, forced to flee or face almost certain death. The scale of the assault was staggering, and the fear that gripped the black population was compounded by the knowledge that those tasked with protecting the law were often the very perpetrators of violence. Colonel Jenks and his state troops joined the operation, bringing machine guns, additional manpower, and a veneer of official authority to a campaign that was already marked by brutality. Over the course of several days, the forces moved methodically through the countryside, rounding up anyone suspected of participating in the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America, or simply present in the wrong place at the wrong time. Accounts from survivors describe families torn from their homes, the elderly and infirm left to fend for themselves, and children witnessing horrors no one should ever endure. Those who surrendered were frequently arrested under trumped-up charges or, worse, executed without trial. Estimates of the death toll vary, but hundreds of black residents were killed, and thousands more were displaced, forced to flee into the surrounding countryside with only what they could carry. The aftermath left the community in chaos, homes reduced to ashes, fields unharvested, and a social fabric ripped apart by fear and grief. The survivors faced not only physical destruction, but also the crushing psychological weight of witnessing friends, family, and neighbors brutally murdered while law enforcement and state authorities looked on or actively participated. The Elaine Massacre, as it came to be known, exposed the devastating intersection of racial prejudice, economic control, and unchecked authority. It was not merely a spontaneous outbreak of violence. It was a coordinated effort that reflected deep-seated fears among white landowners and local officials, who saw the rising assertiveness of black farmers as a threat to their economic dominance and social hierarchy. In their minds, the terror they unleashed was justified. Yet in reality, it revealed the fragility of a system built on oppression and the catastrophic consequences of systemic injustice. For the black residents of Phillips County, survival became both a physical and moral endeavor. Those who escaped the immediate violence were left to rebuild their lives in a landscape scarred by fire, blood, and loss, carrying memories of unimaginable horror and the knowledge that justice, if it came at all, would be delayed and incomplete. The Elaine Massacre serves as a haunting testament to the lengths to which power can be defended through violence, and to the resilience required of communities who, despite facing near annihilation, refused to be silenced or erased from history. As the violence of early October 1919 swept through Phillips County, the full horror of the Elaine Massacre unfolded with chilling clarity, leaving no one untouched by fear or grief. The mobs and state troops who descended upon the black communities made no distinction between age or gender. Women and children alike became targets of indiscriminate brutality. Families who had long labored under oppressive economic conditions now faced a threat far more immediate and terrifying. Survival itself. Homes that had sheltered generations were set ablaze. Fields that sustained entire communities were trampled or burned, and the once familiar landscape of swaying cotton became a scene of chaos and carnage. The air was thick with smoke, the echo of gunfire, and the cries of those fleeing, creating a soundscape that would be seared into memory for anyone who witnessed it. Many residents, knowing the peril that confronted them, sought refuge wherever they could. Swamps, dense thickets, and hidden hollows became temporary sanctuaries, offering only partial protection from the relentless search for victims. In these shadows, families huddled together, trying to maintain courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Listening to the distant reports of gunfire and the approach of armed men, children clung to their parents, and elders, weakened by age or illness, depended on neighbors and relatives to shield them from harm. The desperation of those hiding was compounded by the knowledge that surrendering to the authorities did not guarantee safety. Many who laid down their arms or stepped forward in hope were instead arrested, beaten, or executed, their humanity stripped away in the name of suppressing a perceived threat. Even as the violence raged, stories of individual bravery and small acts of resistance emerged, illuminating the courage and dignity of those who faced near certain death. Some families navigated treacherous terrain for days, moving quietly through the swamps to avoid detection, while others sought the protection of distant relatives or sympathetic neighbors. Yet for many, hiding was a temporary reprieve, and capture often meant a brutal fate, as law enforcement and vigilantes systematically sought to punish anyone associated with the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America. The community's very attempt to assert their rights and organize for fair treatment had been twisted into justification for mass terror, leaving ordinary people to pay an extraordinary price. Accounts from survivors recount moments of unimaginable horror: a child separated from their parents, a family watching helplessly as their home burned, and neighbors dragged from hiding only to be beaten or killed. The deliberate targeting of non-combatants, the elderly, women, and children underscored the merciless intent behind the attacks, which were designed not just to suppress resistance but to terrorize an entire population into submission. In the days that followed, the landscape bore witness to both physical destruction and profound human suffering, with burned homes, discarded belongings, and unmarked graves standing as grim reminders of what had occurred. Yet even amidst the despair, the community's spirit of resilience persisted. Those who survived through cunning, courage, or sheer luck emerged from hiding to rebuild what they could, carrying the trauma of loss and the weight of memories that could never be erased. Their stories, passed down through families and chronicled by observers, offer testimony to the human cost of systemic injustice and the enduring strength of those who, even in the face of near total annihilation, refuse to be silenced. The massacre of Elaine is remembered not only for the lives lost, but also for the resilience of a community that endured terror, survived the unimaginable, and bore witness to history that others tried desperately to erase. In the aftermath of the Elaine Massacre, the surviving black residents of County faced a new and cruel chapter of injustice, one that extended the violence beyond the physical horrors they had endured. Those who had survived gunfire, arson, and flight into the swamps were now confronted with a legal system that turned the very victims of terror into accused criminals. Hundreds of black men and women were rounded up, often arbitrarily, and thrown into makeshift jails under conditions that compounded the trauma they had already suffered. The narrative imposed by local authorities framed the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America, whose members had simply sought fair treatment and timely payments for their labor, as a violent conspiracy, and anyone associated with the union was presumed guilty by default. Inside the confines of the county jail, the stakes could not have been higher. Black individuals, already weakened by hunger, fear, and the shock of seeing their homes destroyed, were subjected to brutal interrogations designed to extract confessions for crimes they had not committed. Torture was a common tool, and the accounts that survive paint a grim picture of deliberate cruelty. Beatings, threats of execution, and psychological torment were inflicted until victims provided the names, actions, or simply the acknowledgement demanded by their captors. The legal machinery of the county worked hand in hand with the mob mentality that had justified the massacre itself, creating an environment in which innocence was irrelevant, and survival often depended on the ability to endure unspeakable suffering. The consequences were immediate and severe. 12 black men, later known as the Elaine 12, were charged with capital murder, despite the fact that many of the deaths in question had resulted from white militias or state troops firing indiscriminately during the rampage. Trials were swift and heavily biased. The presence of armed white citizens outside the courthouses, the lack of adequate legal representation, and the prejudiced local juries ensured that the outcomes were predetermined. Confessions obtained under duress were presented as evidence of guilt, and the men were sentenced to death in a legal process that offered no true opportunity for defense or justice. The stories of their suffering spread, yet few outside the immediate region could imagine the scale of both the physical massacre and the judicial perversion that followed. The broader black community was paralyzed by fear. Families mourned those lost in the violence while also grappling with the reality that their neighbors, friends, and family members were being punished for the same terror they themselves had endured. The systemic injustice highlighted the stark contrast between those wielding power and those denied basic rights, and the legal apparatus became an extension of the same social structures that had fueled the initial attacks. The wrongful imprisonment of the Elaine 12 symbolized the broader effort to suppress black voices, to punish organization and advocacy, and to cement a narrative of subservience and compliance. Despite this, the story of the Elaine 12 eventually reached the attention of activists, journalists, and organizations committed to civil rights, shining a light on the injustice and brutality of the prosecutions. The courage of those who spoke out, investigated, and provided legal support laid the foundation for eventual intervention by higher courts, demonstrating that even in the darkest moments of injustice, advocacy, persistence, and documentation could challenge systemic oppression. The ordeal of being falsely accused, tortured, and sentenced to death underscores the entwined nature of racial violence and judicial abuse in early 20th century America, revealing how the structures meant to protect citizens could instead become instruments of terror when prejudice and fear override justice. The Elaine 12's experience is a haunting reminder of how quickly victims can be transformed into scapegoats when societal and legal systems prioritize power over truth, and how the pursuit of fairness and dignity often comes at tremendous personal risk in a world determined to maintain inequality and control. As the injustice against the black residents of Phillips County continued to unfold, the story of the Elaine 12 began to reach ears far beyond the Arkansas Delta, carried by activists, journalists, and legal advocates who refused to let the massacre and its aftermath remain hidden. Among those who took up the cause were lawyers working with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, including the tenacious and determined C.P. Jones, whose reputation as a skilled advocate for civil rights was soon cemented through his efforts in this case. Recognizing the profound miscarriage of justice, Jones and his team meticulously documented the abuses endured by the accused, confessions extracted through torture, trials conducted under mob intimidation, and verdicts rendered not on evidence but on fear and racial prejudice. The legal battle was daunting, with entrenched local authorities resistant to outside scrutiny, and a judicial system that had long served the interests of the white elite. Yet the persistence of Jones and the Knapp lawyers gradually shifted the momentum. They argued that the Elaine 12 had been denied due process, highlighting how their trials had been tainted by the presence of armed vigilantes outside courthouses, the coercion of confessions under duress, and the systematic exclusion of fair legal representation. Through appeals and persistent advocacy, the case ultimately reached the highest court in the land, and the U.S. Supreme Court acknowledged that the defendants had been deprived of fundamental rights guaranteed under the Constitution, issuing rulings that underscored the dangers of allowing mob influence to dictate judicial outcomes. These rulings were not merely symbolic. They laid the groundwork for the eventual commutation of the death sentences imposed on the 12 men. While the path to freedom was neither immediate nor complete, the intervention of the Knapp and the strategic legal acumen of C.P. Jones created a pathway for justice that had seemed impossible in the chaotic aftermath of the massacre. Over time, retrials, commutations, and parole allowed the men to regain their freedom, though the psychological scars, social disruption, and economic devastation of the Elaine Massacre lingered for years, affecting entire families and communities. Beyond the immediate legal victories, the involvement of the Knapp in the Elaine case resonated as a turning point in the broader struggle for civil rights in the United States. It demonstrated the necessity of organized advocacy, of documenting abuses with precision, and of leveraging national institutions to challenge local systems steeped in prejudice. The courage of Jones and others who intervened showed that even in the face of overwhelming local power, the rule of law, when properly invoked, could serve as a mechanism to confront injustice. Their efforts amplified the voices of those who had been silenced and provided a template for future campaigns to protect civil liberties and human dignity. Moreover, the legal struggle surrounding the Elaine 12 highlighted the broader implications of systemic oppression. The massacre and its aftermath had been designed to instill fear, to punish black citizens for seeking fairness, and to reinforce existing power hierarchies. By challenging these outcomes through the courts, the Knapp not only secured justice for the 12 men but also sent a clear message that racial violence and judicial corruption could not operate with impunity. It was a testament to the power of law, advocacy, and perseverance in a society where the intersection of race and justice often dictated life or death. The story of P. Jones and the Knapp's intervention remains a crucial chapter in the legacy of the Elaine Massacre, illustrating that even amid the deepest darkness of human cruelty, committed individuals and organizations can alter the trajectory of history. Their work ensured that the suffering of the victims was not ignored, that the perpetrators could not fully erase accountability, and that the struggle for fairness, recognition, and equality would continue, a reminder that justice, though delayed, can still be achieved through courage, persistence, and unwavering dedication to human rights. For decades, the Elaine Massacre of 1919 remained a hidden scar on the American landscape, chapter of history so violently suppressed that its memory faded from textbooks, newspapers, and public consciousness. The scale of the tragedy, in which hundreds of black men, women, and children were killed and thousands more displaced, was largely erased from mainstream accounts, leaving generations of Americans unaware of the horrors that had unfolded in Phillips County. Local authorities, newspapers, and historians complicit in upholding the narratives of white supremacy contributed to this erasure, portraying the events as a minor disturbance or, in some cases, as a justified response to an alleged insurrection, ignoring the voices of the victims and survivors whose lives had been shattered. Families who endured the massacre often remained silent, both out of fear and because society offered them no platform to tell their stories, resulting in a collective amnesia that obscured the depth of racial violence in the early 20th century. It was not until decades later that the work of activists, journalists, and historians began to reclaim this lost history, painstakingly reconstructing the events through oral testimonies, archival research, and legal documents. Documentaries such as the Elaine Massacre, Tragedy and Triumph, funded in part by foundations committed to preserving civil rights history, brought renewed attention to the massacre, combining survivor accounts with historical analysis to provide a fuller understanding of what occurred. These works revealed not only the immediate horrors of the killings, but also the systemic oppression that made such violence possible, including economic exploitation, disenfranchisement, and the manipulation of the legal system to punish the very victims of racial terror. By documenting these narratives and situating them within the broader context of the Red Summer and post-World War I social upheaval, scholars and filmmakers challenged the long-standing silence that had allowed the massacre to be minimized or ignored entirely. Efforts to memorialize the victims have also helped ensure that the massacre is not forgotten. In 2019, a memorial was dedicated in downtown Helena to honor those who perished, providing a physical and symbolic space for reflection and remembrance. That same year, the Elaine 12, whose wrongful prosecutions had epitomized the miscarriage of justice in the massacre's aftermath, were commemorated on the Arkansas Civil Rights Heritage Trail, acknowledging both their suffering and their resilience. Educational initiatives have followed, with informational booklets distributed to schools throughout Arkansas, ensuring that students learn not only the facts of the massacre but also the broader lessons about systemic racism, injustice, and the importance of civic courage. These programs aim to cultivate a historical consciousness that recognizes the experiences of marginalized communities and the consequences of ignoring or suppressing uncomfortable truths. The reclamation of Elaine's story demonstrates the power of memory, documentation, and public acknowledgement in shaping how society confronts its past. By preserving survivor testimonies, honoring the victims through memorials, and integrating these narratives into educational curricula, the legacy of the massacre can serve as a lens through which to understand the intersections of race, power, and justice in American history. It reminds us that history is not merely a record of events, but a moral framework for reckoning with injustice, offering lessons about resilience, advocacy, and the ongoing struggle for equality. The tragedy of Elaine, once nearly erased, now stands as a powerful testament to the necessity of confronting historical wrongs and ensuring that the voices of those who suffered are neither silenced nor forgotten, providing future generations with both a warning and a call to action for justice and recognition. The Elaine Massacre of 1919 is more than a historical event. It is a stark reminder of the deep-rooted systems of racism, economic exploitation, and injustice that have shaped American society. The horrific violence that unfolded in Phillips County, the deliberate targeting of black men, women, and children, and the subsequent miscarriage of justice against the Elaine 12 all reveal how power and prejudice were systematically wielded to maintain control over a community striving for fairness and dignity. The massacre was not merely the result of individual cruelty, but the outcome of a broader social, political, and economic structure designed to suppress black voices and opportunities. Sharecroppers who labored tirelessly in the cotton fields were trapped in cycles of debt, manipulated by plantation owners, and denied even the most basic rights, from fair wages to legal protection. When they organized to assert their humanity and demand justice, they were met with lethal force and institutionalized oppression, exposing the fragility of justice when equality threatens entrenched power. Remembering Elaine is not just about recounting a tragedy from over a century ago. It is about recognizing patterns of inequality and learning from the past to create a more just and equitable future. Memorials, documentaries, and educational programs now ensure that the voices of the survivors and victims are no longer silenced. These efforts honor those who suffered, educate new generations, and serve as a call to action against the forces of racial discrimination that continue to persist in different forms today. By confronting this painful chapter, we acknowledge the resilience of communities that resisted oppression and celebrate the courage of those who fought for fairness against overwhelming odds. The struggle of the Elaine 12, supported by the NAP and courageous lawyers like C. P. Jones, exemplifies the enduring power of advocacy and the necessity of standing up for justice, even when the odds are stacked against you. As we reflect on Elaine, it becomes clear that history is not just a record of events, but a mirror that allows us to examine the moral and social choices of our society. The massacre teaches us that silence, complicity, and indifference enable oppression, while remembrance, education, and active resistance promote equity and understanding. Honoring the victims is an act of justice in itself, and carrying their stories forward ensures that their suffering was not in vain. It reminds us that the fight for racial equality is ongoing and that every effort to confront injustice, whether through education, advocacy, or policy, matters. Thank you for joining us on this journey through a crucial yet often overlooked chapter of American history. By learning about the Elaine Massacre, sharing these stories, and engaging with the lessons it offers, we collectively honor those who endured unimaginable hardship and reaffirm our commitment to justice and equality. If you found this story eye-opening, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel for more important historical narratives, and share this video with your friends and family to help spread awareness. Your support helps ensure that stories like Elaine's are never forgotten, and that the struggle for racial equality continues to gain strength with each new generation.